Welcome, everyone, to the Starting Points Myths and Misconceptions about Grief. As you may know, we are doing these podcasts as part of the Starting Points educational series. We are the Starting Point Inc. of New Jersey, and you can find us at Oops, I don't think you're supposed to say that anymore, at startingpoint.org. I'd like to first take this as an opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Loretta Depka. I am the Executive Director at the Starting Point, and we are very excited about reaching new audiences with mental health information, really mental health wellness. Today we're talking about grief. 2 weeks ago, we talked about anger management. So please visit us on the Starting Point Inc. of New Jersey YouTube channel and listen to anger management and others that we will post, and take a second to subscribe. Subscription doesn't cost a thing. All it's about is clicking on the subscription, and that way you'll get alerts when we do new topics. So let's start with introducing Pat Obst, our interviewee for today's session. Pat Obst is a licensed clinical social worker who has been with the Starting Point for over 24 years. She manages a thriving practice as both a therapist and a life coach. Pat works with adults and couples that struggle with anxiety, depression, codependency, and relationship issues. She specializes really in grief and loss therapy, particularly in working with parents who have lost children. You are welcome throughout this process to add questions in the chat. If we have time, we will address them, but right now I would like to welcome Pat. So Pat, thank you for joining us, and start with one of the first myths and misconceptions about grief. I'm sure we've all heard that all loss is the same. And after talking to Pat in preparation for this session, she has some strong feelings about this. So Pat, it's all yours. So Pat, this might be a good time to talk about ambiguous loss. Is that complicated or not complicated?
Ambiguous loss falls in the category more of, and I'm just looking up the notes so I get the name right, has less to do about the type of loss and more to do about resolution. In the 1970s, it's Dr. Pauline Boss. She's the one who coined that term, ambiguous loss. And I'll just read you the definition. It's a loss that occurs without closure or clear understanding. This kind of loss leaves a person searching for answers and thus complicates and delays the process of grieving and often results in unresolved grief. So it creates that some losses by their very nature are complicated. Again, a violent death, a child death, that kind of thing. This ambiguous loss can be, an older parent or whatever. It's not by its nature complicated, but if there are unanswered questions and no closure, like some people are losing parents to COVID, okay, maybe they're older parents or grandparents. That's not by nature complicated grief, but because there's no closure, because they couldn't be there with them at their bedside in the hospital, they couldn't have a funeral, things like that. Now it's ambiguous loss. Does that make sense?
It does.
So it's that when you can't, that's why a lot of times what I try to do is help parents my clients either wrestle with those unanswered questions and get as many answers as they can. But then there comes a time where I really encourage them to accept that they're not going to get all the answers they need, but they can still move on without having all the answers. And if there are certain things like, did my loved one go to heaven or not? Things like that. I always encourage them, believe what makes you feel best. because we can't prove it, right?
Right.
One way or the other. So believe what makes you feel best. And then that gives them some sense of closure and they can move forward. I just want to give one more example on that is I have a client who her daughter went missing for a month and then she was found dead, murdered. And
Oh, horrible.
13 years later, they've never found the person or persons who did that. First 6 years I worked with her, we worked for a long time. Of course, things got better over time, but she has completely recreated her life. She lives out in the Midwest on a lake, has married a wonderful person, has a family through, his children, grandchildren, a life that she never thought she would have, even though she doesn't have the answers. So you can't stay stuck in this ambiguous loss. You have to create the closure within yourself and be able to move forward.
You said something there, Pat, that's making me think about the old wives' tale, I guess it is, that grief should only last a year. Once the year is over, if you lose a spouse, you're supposed to get married, all of or at least start dating. What's the deal? Is grief longer process? It must be for something so tragic as you just mentioned, but
for other types of loss, like loss of a job, loss of a home, those kinds of things, we can usually, they're done and we don't even, years and years later, we don't really get triggered by them, right? It's like, oh, I remember when. It's not, the pain kind of goes away and that sort of thing. But when it comes to people, we never stop grieving because grieving is remembering. And there's what a lot of people don't understand is that there's a physical manifestation of people within our brain. They're dead, they're not gone. There are literally, you hear of neurotransmitters and the synaptic connections in the brain.
Sure.
There are literally clusters for people we love. That's there forever. And you don't know how much comfort that gives to people to know, there's a file drawer for that person. And that's never going away. They are always literally with you in your brain.
I like that.
And so then it's just a matter of tapping into that through their keepsakes, through telling stories, kind of breathing life into it. So grieving lasts forever. A quick example, my mother died when I was 24. Eventually I learned to live without her. I'm 57 now. When I turned 49, I was off. I was upset for a week. I was like, what is going on with me? And then I realized I was going to be without my mother longer than I was with her because I had turned 49. She died when I was 24.
Wow.
And then I listened to what that was telling me. I'm going to be without her longer than I was with her, and that's upsetting me. So what do I need to do? I need to figure out how to be with her. So then I pulled out more pictures. I put her picture as my screensaver on my computer. I sat in her rocking chair more. I have the rocking chair she rocked her first grandchild in. Talked to her more. And then I was fine. So that was 24 years later. But I couldn't have dealt with that layer of grief until I turned 49. Right?
So it's not a year, it's a lot longer.
Forever. But we don't have to be afraid of it. We sit with it, we listen to it, what's it telling us? And then we work that through and we move forward.
So where does, say, the loss of a pet fall in the grieving process? Is that legit?
The people who think it's not don't understand it. It depends on the meaning and the relationship with the pet. Some people, that pet has been with them through some really difficult times in their life. And so when that pet dies, that they're what they're feeling really is the loss of that support, because that was their support and comfort. And so it's not just they're losing a pet, they're also losing a huge part of their support system that got them through life, and now they're afraid they won't have that, moving forward, getting through things in life. Also, if it's associated, I have a client who lost her teenage son in an accident, and she still has her son's dog, and she talks about how, like, she doesn't know what she's going to do when that dog dies, because for her, that's a big part of her connection to her son. Right. So we have to understand that the loss of a pet has more to do with the meaning that we give to the pet.
So it's very individualized.
Yes, and what that pet has been through with us in our lives.
Do people go through, Kubler-Ross's stages were so popular. Do we all go through that? Is that everyone's grief pattern, or?
So Vince, in his, and I'll put a plug for Vince, we're going to be doing the grief series in February on the lectures. He'll do the first 3, and then I'm doing the last one. But he covers those grief stages, which are very important. As far as going through the stages kind of in that order, that was originally meant for cancer patients. The denial, and then the, making deals with God, and, that sort of thing. But it doesn't really apply in general. All of those stages we go through more in that order when it's a cancer patient, but when it's just loss, different types of loss and whatnot, we have all those feelings, but they come and go, and they get all twisted up, and we feel multiple ones at one time, and we can feel the anger and acceptance, like all those feelings can get all mushed together. We go back and forth between them. So the concept is true. We feel all those different stages, but we feel them all together and at different times. It's not a straight line. It's not a linear process.
We have one question from the people with us today, and that's about is suicide an ambiguous loss? How do you categorize something like that?
Again, complicated grief we can indicate complicated grief often by the type of loss. Like a suicide is definitely complicated grief. Ambiguous loss can apply to any kind of loss, complicated or uncomplicated.
Okay.
Because what again, it's about, is there closure? Are there things that are resolved? Are there these unanswered questions left out there? So with suicide, if there was no note, if there was no indication, like I've had clients who the suicide didn't necessarily, it shocked them, but it didn't necessarily surprise them. Okay, because they knew what their loved one was struggling with. But there are some, there might be more ambiguous loss if it came out of the blue, because then people are like, why? Didn't see this coming. And it feels like there are no answers. Then that's more ambiguous. You see?
But I guess what I'm hearing, whether it's complicated or uncomplicated, grief is grief, and we have to feel it. Am I assuming, or?
Everybody's going to do it different. Everybody's going to deal with it differently. I spend a lot of time doing 2 things. One, encouraging people to be patient with their grief journey, because people just, they want to get out of the pain, right?
Sure.
Being patient with it, and also encouraging people to embrace it and not be afraid to embrace it, to lean into it rather than recoil from it. So I actually get people very comfortable with their grief, where they're able to, like, I encourage a lot of my mothers, I say, I always ask them, have you wailed? Because it's very important for a mother who's lost a child to wail, which is very different from crying and sobbing. I mean, wailing, you don't even, if you've never heard it, you don't want to hear it because it's so deep. But it's important that a mother do that. So we talk about where are the places where you can do that. Well, you've got to be able to, whether it's in your car or times when you're in the house alone, to be with it. And the whole snotty cry and just letting that happen, you're laying prostrate on the ground, that you will stop. Like, people trusting themselves, I will stop crying. I'm not going to cry forever.
Right.
I cry for an hour or two, or maybe all day, but the next day I'm not going to be crying again. And to trust that process. And then they're not so afraid to go and be with it and to listen to it and have it help them heal. If you don't go in it, it can't tell you what it needs to tell you. So it's important. It's a living, breathing thing, and we can't deny it. We have to allow it to happen.
When you're watching someone that you care about grieve, you always trip yourself up with saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And, do I call them or do I wait to be called? What's the secret there?
A couple different things. One is, it's okay if we say, I'm sorry for your loss. Some people don't mind that. Other people hate that. I say I encourage people maybe to use the words, my heart breaks for you. My heart goes out to you. Don't ever say you understand. Because even if you've had the same type of loss, somebody lost their mother and you lost your mother too, you don't understand completely, because they might have had a really lousy relationship with their mother and they're feeling very different things than you're feeling, having had a really good relationship with your mother. So I would just say, leave that off the table. Don't ever say you understand. It's different if you're in a support group, like people who are in a support group with the same type of loss, where you've all lost a child. And that's mainly what you can relate. I can relate to that feeling, but you can't understand it. So if somebody's telling a story and they say, yeah, I can relate, I have a similar experience with my grief, but you forget the word understand. And as far as calling, grievers don't have the energy to call you. They just don't. So it's really important that we call them or text them, just to let them know. Don't expect a call back or a text back. Just put it out there so that they know you. It's very important that they know that people care and are thinking about them. Don't hang your hat on whether or not they reach back out to you. Just keep putting it out there every so often, thinking of you, love you, if you need anything. Early on, I would say too, don't say, if you need anything, call me. Tell them what you will. Look, if you need me to give your kids a ride to their activities, if it's a young person whose spouse has died or whatever, if you need me to give your kid a ride to to activities, if you need us to babysit, if you need us to bring over meals, be specific, because then they know that they can ask you for those things because they know you're willing and able to do those particular things. You see what I'm saying? They already know that you're okay doing that, so they don't feel as awkward asking you.
And what about the old thing about bringing food and even like weeks later? Do you still do those unexpected drop-ins, or or immediately after someone has died, people rush to the house like in the olden days, and everybody takes their kids, whatever.
Right. At first there's all that big rush, but you don't want to continue to do that weeks and months out. You want to send the text, you want to leave the voicemail, you want to send a card. And it's okay to say, I would love to give you a call. Can I do that now? Or is now not a good time?
Oh, I like that, Pat. We do that with each other usually anyway.
Yeah. Or I would love to stop over. Are you up for a visit?
Right.
That kind of thing. And even if you say, I would love to stop over this weekend, will you be up for a visit? And they say yes, still contact them. Like, let's say it's Saturday, still contact them Saturday morning and say, we were going to come over. Are you still up for a visit? Because they might feel very differently that day. And that's okay.
So then from the griever side, how are they reacting to all of this love and annoyance? I know it's not, but how can they stop it? Can they stop it? Do they want to stop it?
Do they want to stop having people
visit? And I mean, when we talked about this the other day, about this actual conversation, you said sometimes the griever has to put up boundaries. How do they do that? How do they have the strength to do that?
Well, they just won't answer the call, which is fine. Then I say, give them a little bit more time. And then again, don't pressure. Just say, I'm thinking of you. I said a prayer for you at church yesterday, whatever. That's all. You don't have to pressure them. But as far as the boundaries that you and I were talking about, I think if I remember right, it was kind of in regard to about when people say things to you, and they say sometimes well-meaning things, but things that are not helpful, like, oh, they're in a better place or they're out of pain now. That may be true, but that doesn't help the griever because the griever is in pain.
Right.
And so it's really okay for the griever to say, I appreciate your sentiment, but that's not really helpful right now. It's really okay for us to say that. I'll give you a quick example. There's a movie called Rabbit Hole with Nicole Kidman, and her 7 or 8 year old child runs out in the street, gets hit by a car and gets killed. And she's in a support group for parents who've lost children. And there's a woman who's sitting across from her, and she's wringing her hands, and you can tell she's trying to convince herself of what she's saying. And she's saying, well, God needed another angel. And Nicole Kidman's standing there with her arms crossed, and she says, he's God. He can make his own angels. So, which I love. I love that. And I'm not knocking anybody's spiritual beliefs or anything, but it's just that sometimes people will say things that either don't match up with our faith, or that, because a lot of times people's faith gets blown out of the water when they have such a traumatic loss. Things that just aren't, they actually make the griever mad rather than helping them. Now, I don't think a griever needs to be that bold like Nicole Kidman was, but and say, I appreciate you trying to help, but that's not where I'm at right now. I'm really wrestling with God right now, or whatever. You see what I'm saying? It's okay
Right.
for us to do that.
But that's got to be hard. I mean, it's got to be hard to protect yourself when you're in grief. I mean, you're not functioning correctly.
Right, right. Well, and that's when, that's why it is important when the grief is that intense to see a therapist, because the therapist can help give you some of that. I mean, I give my clients some of that verbiage to say response, and help them have the courage to speak up and that sort of thing, so you don't have to do it alone.
There's some other myths we talked about, and I guess the one that you know you need to get out more and enjoy life. That's always the advice that I've heard. So, what do you have to say to that, Pat?
Grief flu. So when you have the flu, well, when you don't have the flu, you're watching TV, commercial comes on, you get up, you go into the kitchen, you get something to drink, you come back, you finish watching your show. When you have the flu, you're laying on the couch. Commercial comes, you get up, you shuffle to the kitchen, you get a drink, you shuffle back, you collapse onto the couch, and you sleep for 3 hours. Why? Because your body is so busy trying to fight off the flu that it's exhausted. And so grief is the same way, especially early on. We are exhausted. I tell my clients, it's like you're climbing up Mount Everest with 10 bags of groceries in either hand. I mean, it's hard. And so to be up, when you're around people, you have to be up. It's so heavy. It's like having the flu, right? I mean, it takes so much effort just to walk to the kitchen when you have the flu. Well, it takes so much effort to be out among people at dinner with friends that you just can't do it very much. So I always tell people to pace themselves. There's a certain amount of isolation that is necessary and normal in grief. Now, you have to be careful. And again, that's part of the reason why it's important to have support people, whether it's a support group, whether it's a therapist, who can help you gauge what's healthy and what's unhealthy with that. Okay. So it is important to have a foot in life, because eventually joy will come back. And if you're not living life, you won't get that spark of joy, if you're just cloistered in your home all the time. But early on, especially, you're just going through the motions. So even if you go out, you're not going to really have fun. You might smile or laugh, but it doesn't feel like that inside. But I encourage people to pace themselves. Don't go out Friday night, Saturday nights. It's like if you've got bad knees, you might go to the flower show on Saturday, you're going to be sitting on your butt on Sunday because you need that down day because you were on your knees all the day before. So I encourage people to pace themselves. Like if you're going to go out on Friday night, don't do anything else the rest of the weekend, because you're going to need that recovery time, because it's so heavy to go out on Friday night that you're going to need to rest on Saturday and Sunday. So I encourage people to pace themselves, because going out all the time can actually make somebody crash and burn. Because at that point too, they're avoiding their pain, which is not good. And they're pushing themselves too much. So there needs to be an ebb and a flow to it.
I imagine just what you're saying. I mean, so I guess what I'm hearing you say is that grief needs to be felt. And so how do you pace yourself?
You pay attention. So one of the big things I teach people is awareness of their body, awareness of their emotions. Like, for instance, I'll say to people, if you find yourself getting really irritable you're biting everybody's head off, you probably need one of those really good cries. Because what's happening is it's all building up. And you need to just go be by yourself, take a long drive, whatever it is, and let yourself, put on the sappy music. And they always say, you're right, it made me feel better. Then I wasn't biting everybody's head off. So your family members will be grateful that you went and had a good cry too. Uh, but awareness is a big part of it. And we have to listen. What is our grief telling us? It's part of the reason why I have people journal, because that way they're not only listening, but when they write it down, they can then read it and see, what is it saying that I'm really struggling with? Because then that gives us guidance on what we need to work on. So awareness is a really big part of grieving too, because that way you know what it is you need. So if your spouse keeps trying to get you to go out, or your girlfriends, from work keep trying to get you to go out and be busy, and that's going to make you feel better. If you going out, you're feeling exhausted, and pay attention to that and say, wait a minute, I'm feeling exhausted and really irritable the next day. Every time we do that, you're probably not ready. Listen to that and back up and put a boundary up there and tell your girlfriends, look, I'm not going out every weekend. Every other weekend. And just on Friday night. I need to pace myself. So awareness is a big part of it.
So grief is not affected by sheer willpower, is what I'm hearing you say.
Well, for a time. But here's the thing, it's not unusual for me to have people come see me years and years later after they stuffed it. And now they're, an alcoholic, or they've lost their job, or their marriage has ended because they were so miserable. You can't do that. Grief is a real thing. It's powerful. It's a living, breathing thing. We need to treat it as such and let it do what it needs to do. We will come through it if we allow ourselves to work through it and not be afraid of it. And that's why, I often use the phrase, we need to learn to do grief well, because we're going to have a lot of loss in our lives. And if we learn to do it well, that doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean it's fun. Doesn't, just, if we're not afraid of it, we can be in it and pay attention and work our process and not make apologies for it.
And how do you teach your children to have a relationship with grief so that they can have that healthy relationship?
Being little ones, children?
Well, yeah, I would say little ones. How do we start that process of having them understand it?
Right. Well, unfortunately, most of the parents I work with over the last 5 years, especially 5-10 years, has been parents who've lost their children to drug-related deaths. Because there's that window. My daughter somehow escaped it, but she has lost so many friends in that generation. She's 31.
Oh.
So many parents, their kids are between 25 and 35. It's when opioids were being passed out like candy, right?
Right.
So a lot of those parents that I work with have grandbabies who are 5-6 years old, who no longer have a mother or father or both.
Ugh.
And so a lot of what they're asking me is, how do we, what we learned, what we know with grief is that, in the olden days, it was, you wouldn't tell children things. You'd keep them in the dark, and then their imaginations run away with them, right?
Right.
Now it's important for them to be part of the grief process. And we don't need to give them the gory details, right? But it's important for us to help them find ways to connect with their loved one. I often encourage grandparents to create some sort of garden in their yard, whether it's trees, flowers, a bench, whatever. That's that place where they can, for themselves as well as their grandchild, can go to be with their loved one, feel close to them. So you have the kids paint rocks that say, I love you, mommy. If mommy loved butterflies, you paint a butterfly on the rock. And so you put those rocks in a rock garden around her favorite flowers, let's say. And then you can go out there with your grandchild. You can tell stories about their mommy, and help them to be with their grief in real tangible ways. Make a teddy bear out of their clothing, and then that child has a teddy bear to hold on to. And when you're afraid at night, mommy's still with you. Hold your bear, and she'll make you feel better, the way she used to when she was here. Doesn't mean they're not going to.
Like that. That's adorable, Pat.
It doesn't mean that they're not still going to, feel pain and cry, but it's teaching them to be able to be sad and be with it, but then also be comforted by connecting with their loved one.
Right.
And be able to learn to live with them in an intangible way. When somebody's here, we have a tangible relationship with them. See them, touch them, hear them, right? But we also have an intangible relationship. We feel love for them. They have a personality. We think about them. We can't touch those things, right?
Right.
When we die, the tangible goes away. The intangible is still there. What I do is help people to connect with that intangible so that they can learn to live with that grief that's always going to be there, with that loss that's always going to be there, but in a way that turns from pain to eventually, then it's kind of bittersweet, to then it's comforting to see pictures or to tell stories or that kind of thing.
So then, when is the best time to, say, remove your loved one's belongings? Does that help with your own grief, or?
Everybody's different. I know some people who they get rid of everything. If that's what they need to do, that's okay. If other people don't want some of those things. I've had people who said, my mother got rid of all my father's stuff and I wanted some of it. No, that's not very considerate, and it's, not very healthy. But in general, there's no timeline. Sometimes people go through things in several passes. In other words, let's say they have to clean out a house, right? So they'll go through things, and then they'll put a bunch of boxes of things that they can't make decisions about in their basement. And then maybe next year on the anniversary, they'll go through those things and they'll get rid of more. Or a lot of times, people want to donate things. I had a couple who lost their son, and he had gone through the mechanics program at tech school. And so he had a lot of tools, really good tools. They had those tools donated to the tech school, and there's a plaque over the whole tool, one of those big tool stands and everything, with his name and in his memory. And that made them feel so good to be able to donate those tools that other students are going to use. And so, that helped them in their grief to be able to do that. Some people never. I still have Ricky's things. I don't know if the people who are listening know, I lost a son 18 years ago, an infant son, and I still have his things. There's no reason for me to get rid of them. I mean, not many. He only lived for a day, so I have a treasure box of things. But and we can add to the things we have.
Talk about that.
Things that are that connect us with them. I have a client who, and I can't go into the details, but she cannot have pictures of her son around because of some things with her other children. I'll just leave it at that. So it's hard for her because she wants to feel him close. So we talked about what other types of things are connected with him. And she used to say when he was little, because he was like this jumping bean. She said he was like my little frog. I used to call him my little frog because he just, he was rambunctious and he just jumped and hopped everywhere. So I said, so do you have any frogs in your house? So she went online and she found the cutest little frog, little statue things. And so nobody knows what they mean but her.
Cool.
So she kind of keeps him close through those things. They make her smile. But yet her other children aren't. Well, again, I can't go into the issue, but so we can sometimes I buy butterfly things because that's what's associated with Ricky. Every time I go on a vacation, I get a keychain or something with his name on it. So this is 18 years later. So we can actually accumulate some things. I have people write in journals to their loved one about what's going on in their daily life. It makes them feel connected. I have women who's like their mother was their best friend. I talk to my mother every day. I say, well, write to her every day. And that makes them feel better. Now, eventually, they're usually not writing every day, but just for them to know, I have this journal over here that when I really feel like I want to, where I would pick up the phone and say to my mother, that guess what your grandson did today, because he's growing up and she's missing that. She'll write it in the journal. He learned how to do this today. Guess what, Mom? And it makes them feel connected. And there's nothing unhealthy about that. That doesn't mean that the person is not accepting. These people accept that their loved one is dead, but they're never gone.
So
Connect with them in these other ways.
there's a question in the chat room. Is there such a thing as being stuck in grief? So what you just talked about, what's the difference?
Stuck in grief is when you're two things. One, sometimes people their whole lives have kind of been victim mode people, blame of self, blame of others, external locus of control. Everything's about what's happened to me on the outside and that affects how I feel, rather than internal locus of control of no matter what happens around me, I can still find beauty in the world or whatever. So some people are stuck in that victim mode. It's a very comfortable space for them to be, even though they'll complain about it. It's very familiar, comfortable for them. And so that's where they stay stuck in that with their grief. So in other words, it's very similar to how they live anyway. And sometimes you can get people out of that and sometimes not. I mean, I've had one person who that's where she wanted to live. That's where she took up residence and there was no getting her out of it. Other people, especially parents who've lost children, feel like if I stop grieving, then I'll forget about that person and I don't want to ever forget about them. If I stop grieving, I'm afraid they'll think that I don't love them. These are the real thoughts that people have. And I always encourage them, your brain is meant to heal. And you will never, I guarantee, well, first of all, I think pretty much everybody, no matter who you lose, you're never going to forget them, but especially parents. Tell them you will never, ever, ever forget your child. So just take that concern off the table. It won't happen. So when people realize that they might forget certain stories or whatever, but sometimes people stay stuck because they're afraid if they stop grieving, they're going to disconnect, which is, again, why I try to help people. How can you connect as you move forward? How can you connect with that person as you The book I'll write someday is going to be for parents who lost children and say, healing while bringing your child with you. So that's why it's important to teach people how to recreate their lives after loss and bring the spirit of that loved one forward with you. Then you won't stay stuck.
So there is a time then that grieving is finished. No? I know that was a trick question there.
An example, my mother-in-law, she helped me through the loss of Ricky. We would sit at the table and she taught me how to make Italian meatballs. And we would talk about it, and she had several losses. I think she had about 7 losses in some stage of pregnancy, one that was as far along as mine, which was 7 months. And she cried. She was 82 years old. And she cried about the baby she had lost. Okay. So no, we've always, we remember and we still feel it. It's part of our history. But that's okay. We don't have to stop grieving.
So grief isn't necessarily a negative emotion.
Right. Somebody asked me on another podcast, what is the color of grief? And I think she was expecting me to say some dark color. And I said, green. She said, green. And I said, because it's green to me is life. Think about it. Springtime, everything becomes green, right? Because I believe that life comes out of grief. I believe that we can grow and evolve and in some ways become stronger than we were before. It's called PTG, post-traumatic growth, where we actually have growth that comes out of the experiences we've been in. And that we can, have joys or purpose or meaning that we would have never had otherwise, if we allow it. So a loss, it's a bad thing in that we wish it wouldn't have happened. But the grieving process never ends, and that's not a bad thing. We can live with it. It'll come and go. It took till I was 49 for that layer of my mother's grief to hit me. And then it was fine. We have to trust that we can get triggered or have that pain and roll through it and keep going. We have to learn to live with it instead of trying to run from it or get rid of it.
Are there things you can do? There's another question in the chat about, is there a natural approach that can assist the grieving process? And the mention of herbs or, does that help? Is there, well, I guess the real question is, what is the relationship between your health and grief, your physical health?
Well, there's a lot. Certainly, cortisol and those stress hormones. I mean, we know for a fact that they're not great for our body. They cause inflammation, which then causes all kinds of health problems, which is why it's important for people to get support early on, before, that kind of thing happens. But you can't pressure. I mean, there's some people who they say, like I've read some books on grief that say, make sure you're taking good care of yourself and getting good sleep and good nutrition. I gotta tell you, these people in my office are saying, screw it. Okay. They don't care. I mean, I have mothers who say to me, if I go to the doctor tomorrow and they tell me I have cancer, I don't care.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So that doesn't mean that they're suicidal. They're just feeling like, if a bus hits me, oh well, because the grief is just so all consuming. So, can you try not to, drink a bottle of wine a day and eat Twinkies all day long, but you're not necessarily going to be taking care of all that. Doesn't mean not to encourage people to not go off the deep end. But things like walks are encouraged because they can connect the walk with thinking about their loved one, praying, a meditative walk, feeling close to their loved one. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Clearing their head. So that way they're getting some level of exercise in. So that's a natural thing. Usually people can't meditate, although I do help people do like breathing exercises and things, because the nervous system has two parts. You have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is the fight, flight, freeze. Okay. The parasympathetic is the chill out part of the nervous system. Okay. The way you remember it is, think of a parachute, just kind of floats down, calm. Okay. That's how I remember. Parasympathetic is the calm part. When you deep breathe, it sort of turns on the parasympathetic nervous system, because the switch for that is up through the vagus nerve, which ends at your diaphragm. When you're anxious, you breathe with the top of your lungs. So you're not turning on the parasympathetic nervous system. When you breathe deeply, you're turning on the calm part of your nervous system. So I do try to teach people some breathing, because there's a lot of anxiety as well as depression with grief. Deep breathing can, it puts oxygen in the brain and lowers your blood pressure and that sort of thing. So those are other things that can be helpful. If people are having trouble functioning, it really is okay to be on medication, because we certainly can help them get off of that medication, 6 months, 9 months, a year later, when they've got more healing under their belt, as well as they've got some coping skills and that sort of thing too, and some of these natural things. Some people can't sleep, so the sleep apps, the guided meditations to help people sleep. It's all very individualized, but yes, there are natural ways. I don't know really necessarily about, herbs and oils and that sort of thing. My daughter's a doctor, and so she clues me in about some of that stuff, even CBD oil. You have to be careful, because all of those things can interact with medications. So although they seem natural, you got to be careful. Where, meditation, walking, deep breathing, you're not going to have any side effects.
Right. Pat, I could talk to you all afternoon, but I know you have a schedule to keep. So I think we're just going to have to do this again. That's all.
Sure. There's plenty more that we can cover. And the thing is, we can cover other types of losses that are more, other things like divorce and job loss, or multiple losses in different areas of your life and that sort of thing. There's not just loss due to death. So to be continued. Maybe we'll make it a series.
I like that idea. That's a great idea. We'll talk after this.